Hi there, it's Polly here with Mr. Snoots. Now, I have covered in this little series of transgender history several quite colourful transgender women. That is, people who have been born assigned male at birth or intersex and have then chosen to live their life in the female gender. So it's time to do some trans-masculine people. That is, people who have been assigned female at birth or who are intersex and who have chosen to live as men. Took me a little while to get to this, sorry, I just wanted to lay some foundations first. Now, a little caveat. There are many stories of cross-dressing women that took on male personae temporarily, sometimes for many years, but it was very often for a goal. So you'll find some quite famous people like there was a famous female soldier during the War of the Spanish Succession and Wars of the League of Augsburg. We're talking 1690s through to like 1710s here, who dressed as a man and joined the army under a male identity to look for her husband, who had been dragged into the army by a press gang. And there are many examples of women, particularly in the American Civil War, taking on male personas to follow and find lovers that have been taken up by the army, or find sons, brothers, all sorts of things like that. So I'm not going to cover people who had this identity for a while and then willingly let it drop and were happy to live as women under other circumstances. There are many more trans-masculine figures, however, preserved in history than trans women. And I think it's because in earlier times they weren't seen as shameful, as vile, as possibly homosexual as a man wanting to be a woman, because it kind of tickled the patriarchal ego that men are so incredibly superior and so incredibly admirable that people go to any lengths to be one. So these stories were kind of often preserved almost gleefully. I'm going to cover one now who needs to be our first, and this is James Barry. Dr. James Barry, Surgeon James Barry. So, James Barry, a really interesting person. Their story begins really sort of around the Napoleonic War sort of era. So, James Barry was born in County Cork in Ireland in about 1795. We don't have an exact date, but his mother, in later correspondence to someone, in a dated correspondence in 1810, mentions that her child is 15 years old. So this is the best counting back that we have. So James Barry was born Margaret Ann. So his mother was Mary Ann, and she was the sister of James Barry, and James Barry was the professor teaching classical art and portraiture at the Royal Academy of Art in London. So this is like the toffee-nosed art dude that the nobility goes to for their portraits and for the training of all the artists of the era, of that entire wonderful kind of 1790s Jane Austen-y sort of era. But the Irish end of the family was born into poverty. It looks like James's mother was very estranged from her husband. There was another child born after James, and this might have been due to an affair from an extramarital affair, because the husband then leaves. There's a whole crashing down of this whole relationship, and the The husband does reappear later on, kind of like saying that he forgives them, etc. But yeah, we do not know. So it seems that from a very early age, Margaret Ann Barry preferred to dress as a boy and preferred to be addressed as a boy. And his mother indulged it. Seemed to be quite accepting and very supportive of this. Now, there is some ridiculous controversy about whether James Barry was perhaps intersex. We'll touch on that later. I do not think there is evidence to support this at all. But, so in 1804, with finances in ruins, that whole family from Ireland, mum and now 3 children, dad's left again, they head to London to try and apply to this wealthy, famous relative for support. Please help us. And he's not interested. When they get there, he just waves them away, because really doesn't want the poor end of the family turning up and, you know, raining on his parade with the nobility, essentially. Somehow they managed to keep it together. But it looks like James had a couple of ambitions. One seemed to have a huge interest in medicine, but also wanted to be a soldier. Is recorded quite early on in conversations, and is recorded in preserved correspondence, saying, "Were I not a girl, I would be a soldier." But with things going to pieces, they did get a little bit of support, financial support, and managed to get an education for James. It was decided to go to Edinburgh. Edinburgh had a very, very famous medical university, and they decided that James would take on a full-time identity as James, would travel to Edinburgh, and would enroll as a student there in Edinburgh University and take a degree in medicine. His mother basically got tickets on a steamer or on a ship to go north up to Edinburgh, and was, from that point, upon coming on the ship, James assumed a complete male identity, which they did not drop for 1 nanosecond of their very long and very fruitful life. The story told was the mother was heading up to Edinburgh, where she did have some minor work, but of course needed a man, needed a son to accompany her, and so this kid was introduced as the son. People recalled that he was a very pretty young man, beautiful skin, quite slight, quite small, but very outspoken and very energetic. And this comes through in James's life. I love him, as I've read correspondence, as I've read the guy's letters and so on. I would describe him as a bit of a termagant. Definitely had opinions, and those opinions were actually usually right. And if you didn't like the opinions, he'd probably kick you in both shins. But James went up to Edinburgh in 1812, studied to get medical degree. While there, also studied some interesting things like history and moral philosophy, natural philosophy, the legal side of medicine. So it became quite erudite, sort of aced the exams. And again, was commented on as being sort of a slight and pretty young man. And the portraits actually, James looks great, but James then came down to London to put the finishing touches on his education as a surgeon, and passed the surgeon's exams at the London College of Surgeons, and bang. Now, so they both a doctor and a surgeon, which at the time, sometimes a surgeon wasn't much. You could get like job as a military surgeon or a naval surgeon without very much to recommend you, because it was often, often largely sawing bits off people. The more studied surgeons of the period are rare, and that approach of taking a full medical degree with the naturalism and the law and legal side of medicine and the philosophical side of medicine, which included very early what we would think of as psychology today. That's a rare fish indeed. And then to go down and get your surgeon's qualifications on top. This is someone making a very, very thorough job of being the best possible doctor and surgeon that they can. Now, James joined the army. This was their ambition. 1814, they managed to get into the army. And they served at the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, which is a military hospital, where casualties from the Napoleonic Wars are coming back and clearing. Later on was also at the Army Hospital at Portsmouth. These are quite important posts. So this young man is, if you can think of rank, ensign, surgeon's assistant, and was serving there through 1815. So that's Waterloo, those sorts of periods there. So interesting times to be a surgeon and a doctor. Lots of casualties coming through and lots of work and lots of opportunities to do some fairly extraordinary surgeries. Very early on, James became quite interested in the condition of soldiers, what their diet was, what their sanitation was. Sanitation was everything from toileting facilities to clean water, washing their hands, having the ability to bathe, having laundry done, making sure that their diet was properly varied, making sure that sleeping quarters were not overcrowded. Very keen on wanting soldiers to have downtime, to have time to relax without being harassed. And this very, very poor upbringing that James had had kept him very much in touch with poor people for the rest of his life. He became a champion of these health and sanitation rights for the poor and underprivileged wherever he went, became a major international champion of this. So what then happened was our young ensign gets promoted up to essentially the surgical equivalent of a lieutenant and is then sent to South Africa, to the Cape Colony. Now, the Cape Colony is an important one at the time. It was where Britain was essentially basing its projection of power into the Indian Ocean and beyond. It was a long journey. You had to go down Africa. The Cape, which had been taken from the Dutch in these wars, was a very important place because you'd taken a lot of damage on your ships on the way down. This is where you could get new spars, new cordage, get your water, get your provisions, probably pick up extra crew before you head onwards to India, to Ceylon, to the East Indies, to Australia later on. So it's a very important place, but it was, of course, a very wild place. Not only were there, well, let's face it, amongst other things, the Zulus, but there was a hostile Boer population there. James turned up and there was very little medical staff there, so James was very swiftly given enormous responsibilities as a senior medical inspector for the entire South African region. This meant not only responsibility for the health care for the port and the troops garrisoned there, but also the outer garrisons, the forts and outposts, all of it. A huge responsibility for, still a fairly young man. And in so doing, he became extremely good friends with the governor of the colony. Yeah, so Lord Charles Somerset was the governor of Cape Colony. Seems to have sparked up a very deep friendship, and it's actually thought that they might have had an affair, that there might have been a romantic attachment between them, in which case the governor would have known James's secret. James, through all this, has managed to conceal the fact that he is female in body form. He was incredibly strict about his privacy. As a medical officer, he was not in barracks. And also, when you joined the British Army as an officer, there was no medical exam, so no one ever took a look. So he managed to sail on through. He did some amazing things in that Cape Colony. He performed the first successful Caesarian section by a white person upon another white person, where both mother and child were, completely safe. What was her name? Let's have a look. It was a fantastic name. Hold on. Wilhelmina Munnik. Isn't that a great name? And became quite famous for this procedure thereafter. And became a very, very loud champion of the rights of the troops, the health of the troops, insisted loudly on rehousing the troops properly, in changing their sanitation facilities and so on, and was fought bitterly by officers, and so bitterly, and defended these rights for their troops essentially so intensely that they were challenged to a duel by another officer, and James took him up on it and shot the bugger. Square in the forehead, but the guy was wearing a peaked cap that had a really dense, essentially a curbally peak, and it was enough, it basically knocked the guy senseless, probably broke his skull, but it deflected enough so it didn't, ventilate him from one side of the skull to another. So I take it the guy was severely injured but did survive. But yeah, James had a temper in service of the causes that he held dear, and was perfectly willing to stand up to bullies and perfectly willing to stand up to the system, and had absolutely no worshipfulness towards social order whatsoever. Didn't care if you were a lord, a lady, baron, baronet, James would go for you. Fantastic person. Later on, James got shifted to Mauritius, which, if you look at your map, you'll see it off to the side there. It is between India and South Africa. Again, it is an important stop on the India route. It had been a colony taken over by the French, and there were some obviously, it seems that he was being asked again to take over that area and revamp things the way he had done in Cape Colony, because wherever he went, life improved for the soldiers. And you've got to understand, in these colonial posts, disease was what killed everyone. There was absolutely ruthless amounts of deaths, but a lot of it was entirely preventable deaths from typhoid and cholera, which are mostly, as you know, spread by, fecal contamination, etc. And also a lot of the malarial sort of diseases and so on. It was not known, of course, that these were borne by mosquitoes, but it was known that things like stagnant water and foul water and so on were dangerous. So anyway, off to Mauritius. Now, came thundering back from Mauritius when that governor of Cape Town became extremely ill. And actually, James took a bit of a risk there, because when absent without leave, to go leave their post in Mauritius and go and treat the governor. But it was successful, and again, much cried up as a major medical success. So James had quite an active colonial career. When the Crimean War began, so 1850s, that was where you might remember, charge of the Light Brigade, all that sort of thing. Again, the British Home Army had appalling sanitation and diet for its soldiers and so on. In comes James Barry. By this stage, James Barry has reached, the equivalent of a major, has become, and then as the war progresses, is actually raised to be the Medical Inspector General, which is a very high rank indeed, and had furious fights with your friend and mine, Florence Nightingale. They hated each other. He thought Nightingale was essentially ignorant of the science of medicine, did not know what good nutrition was, and did not know what... And essentially, Barry brought her up for being filthy, insisted that she wash her hands and remove her long, broad skirts and so forth before dealing with troops, and shouted at a big parade ground ceremony at Nightingale, basically, to basically leave, go, until she'd come back in more practical wear. And Nightingale was absolutely incensed, because Nightingale was a celebrity, and no one shouts at celebrities. But James Barry did. So, did exactly the same for the troops in the Crimea as he'd done everywhere. Sanitation, water supply, foodstuffs, heating, making sure soldiers weren't crowded, reducing casualties from infection in wounds, and doing an awful lot of surgery. After that war, Barry ended up in the Caribbean area, in the British colonies there, both in Jamaica, in the Windward Isles, and in the Leeward Isles. There had been some revolutions and so on there. There was major unrest in the areas. Ex-slave populations had their risings, and but these were also areas just renowned for the amount of death and disease. So again, Barry seems to have been the person you sent to clean an area up. Did good work there, and then ended up in Canada, of course, British possession at the time, and there was raised to be the highest military rank for an active surgeon, the equivalent of a brigadier general. This rank was made official locally, as in that's what they were raised to. It's called a brevet rank. Barry's equivalent army rank had been colonel. These guys have raised him to be a brigadier general, but that brevet was then confirmed. So James Barry became the second highest ranked military medical officer in the British Empire. The only person higher was essentially the head of the actual entire army medical department, who was not a practical hands-on person. That was really an administrative position. James Barry was essentially the highest ranked active doctor and surgeon in the British Empire. Served in Canada with the usual stoush-ups. Got into trouble when had a huge fight with some of the local clergy, who on soldiers' days off were organising mandatory church services at 2 p.m. on the soldiers' day off. So the soldiers couldn't, these were colonial posts, the soldiers really couldn't have a family day, because they had to be there on the sodding post and be there at 2 o'clock to go to these wretched compulsory services. Barry wanted these things, if you're going to have a compulsory service, it's got to be first thing in the morning, and then release the men to do whatever they want if it's honestly their day off. They need their off time. And again, there was court-martials about this because of the language he'd used. I think he pulled a senior churchman's cap down around his head and all this sort of thing. Like I said, he was quite a character. After Canada and so on, Barry ends up back in the UK and is working in that rank, changing the conditions for British soldiers on home service. Now, by this stage, Barry was starting to get to old age. By sort of the beginning of the 1860s, Barry's hit 65. And so, much to his annoyance, he ends up retired from military life. Lives in quiet retirement, quiet for him, meaning minimal fistfights with someone over local sanitation. And then, ironically, for someone who's fought their whole life for sanitation, died of dysentery in 1865, American Civil War time. That's how long this guy's active career has gone. 1795, French Revolution, this guy is born, dies, end of the American Civil War. Think of how much history he saw happen. He had become extremely good friends with a lot of the local doctors. When he died, he had left very, very, very strict instructions that there was to be no examination of his body. He was simply to be wound in whatever sheets he happened to have died in. He was not to be undressed. He was just to be untouched and left alone. Now, a charwoman, which is basically, a cleaning woman, turned up, and in the local area where she was, she seems to have had the extra job of laying out the dead, which she did expecting basically a tip from bereaved households. But Barry didn't really have a bereaved household, so she seems to have done this, and then there was no one to get money from. So this charwoman came running up to a Dr. McKinnon, who was Barry's very good friend, who had attended him in his final illness and so on, and she claimed to know a secret. And she claimed that James Barry, when she had examined the body, had been a woman. What's more, she said that Barry had stretch marks showing that Barry had actually given birth to a child. This seemed highly unlikely. She thought that she might get hush money for covering up the scandal, but the doctor wasn't interested. It's not really a scandal. No one cares. Nobody cares. The highest ranking surgeon in the British Army lived an amazing life, and this isn't really a scandal. No one really cares. It's not that shocking. There's some preserved correspondence from the head of the coroner's office, what was his name? George Graham, who actually wanted some clarification from this doctor because he was trying to fill out his forms and was saying, should I put James Barry down as deceased man or deceased woman? We have paperwork to fill out after all. And Dr. McKinnon basically quietly said that put him down as deceased man. It is not our affair. If I ever thought of the matter, I thought of James physically as being perhaps a hermaphrodite, meaning he thought that James might have been imperfectly formed, an intersex person, basically with essentially undeveloped male genitalia. So had remained at kind of a child's size, was sort of the implication there. But obviously he's never really seen his friend naked. So Surgeon James Barry was buried with full military honours as James Barry and was eulogised and remembered as such. Later investigations of correspondence from James's mother and so on, fills out the tale a little. There's been some people claiming that James was intersex somehow. There is no evidence for this at all. I think that just soothes male egos that a woman has somehow managed to live successfully as a man, and not just successfully as a man, but reach the absolute pinnacle of their chosen career, and a very masculine career, both as a soldier and as one of the top surgeons in the world. The mother in her correspondence and her reminiscences, said that James as a child was born female, and they talked about and discussed what their child wanted, and the child wanted to be male, and so dressed as male, was spoken to as and spoken of as male. And when they made that trip in 1809, so that's when this kid's 13, 14, heading up to go to Edinburgh. Oh, sorry, heading off to London and everything. That's when they start presenting full-time entirely as male. So I believe that the evidence shows that this was what we would now say a transgender man. Someone that was assigned female at birth because of their observed sexual characteristics, but who felt so strongly male in themselves that they decided to live the life of a man and present entirely as a man without pause, let or hindrance, in private life as well as public life, and never wavered. So look, again, this is a transgender person who absolutely blazed like a meteor through their chosen profession. Surgeon James Barry became essentially the senior hands-on working surgeon in the British Empire. Served in the main major hospitals during the in Britain during the Napoleonic War, South Africa out in the Cape, Mauritius, in the Caribbean, served in Malta as well, and in Greece, which were clearing stations for casualties from the Crimean War. And in each of these cases, there was a huge cholera outbreak in Malta. James Barry is brought in to try and deal with the cholera breakout. Where's it coming from? How do we change it? How do we change the water supply? So this person had a huge effect on the world they lived in. They seem to have been loved by the people that they kindled friendships with, and seen as a cantankerous bastard by those entrenched authorities who felt that they were of too high a position to have to listen to good advice. James Barry would never, ever, ever suffer fools, and indeed went so far as to try shooting a couple. I love James Barry. I love the fact that James Barry lived this incredibly fruitful life. And they deserve to be remembered and their story celebrated as a transgender person who truly made a huge footprint in history. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. James Barry, there is a lot of correspondence and so on surviving. You can find it all actually online. You'll be able to find things like their exam results, the paperwork of them joining up in the army. All these things are preserved. The coroner's reports, it's all there. If you ever wanted to do further research, if that is your thing. But Mr. Snoots and I will leave you there with the very happy tale of a transgender man who lived an incredibly long and incredibly fruitful life. Cheers, everybody. Look after yourselves. Take great care of your personal safety, particularly if you're over in the USA. And much love to you all. Okay. You want to turn it? You want to